You ever 4-star your whole board and still lose fights? Well, the reasoning why that may be happening is because of positioning, because getting the team comps down is only one part of the game. So in this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about how to position in set 16. This is going to include general basic positioning tips that apply to every single set, but also a lot of champion specific and augment tips that only apply to set 16. So we're going to start off with the basic tips, but if you want to skip that section, go straight to the champions where you'll find out a lot of hidden text. Feel free to do so. But let's just jump right into the general positioning tips. So first one I want to cover is about the early game. So a lot of people, when they plan the early game, they might wonder, how come sometimes I lose by all 4 units or all 5 units, and then other times I lose by 1 or 2? Well, the reason why is because sometimes you're focus firing, sometimes you're not. Some people, they just place their units randomly. For example, in a lot of endgame positionings, you might see a pretty spread out team. However, the reason why you spread out in the late game is because you want to avoid a lot of area of effect abilities, because a lot of the more expensive units have that. However, in the early game, you don't have to worry about that. Also in the early game, the goal is to focus fire down targets and either win the round that way because you get more chances to outnumber your opponent, or you can lose more gracefully by focusing and killing 1 or 2 units every single round, saving you around 5 to 10 health over the course of stage 2. So how do you do that? A lot of people, again, they default to the spread out positioning. Maybe instead of Viego, they have Draven, and they have like, oh, I got 2 defender, 2 quick striker. This is how I normally position in the late game. And then they end up not killing anything because Draven's going to be attacking the persons over there, and Ashe is going to end up attacking the person over here. So the way to fix this is to do what's called focus firing. Move all your units to one side, and that way, if they have a unit over here, all your units attack that unit, they die, and then they move on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. You pretty much do that until stage 4, or unless you have a very specific matchup, in which case you might need to unclump. Let's say you're playing Bilgewater. There are going to be some times where you want your Senna and Misfortune next to each other, but for the most part, you normally put 1 unit bottom left, 1 unit bottom right if you have 2 ranged units. If you have a third one, let's say you want to add in an Azir, you might want to put him in the middle or put him maybe 1 hex offset. But you generally don't want the units right next to each other because then they both get hit by area of effect abilities and they often get targeted together. Another thing you need to look out for when you are positioning is wrapping. So going back to the early game example where we didn't have too many units, if you position something like this, what's going to happen is that the enemy Tryndamere is going to walk from all the way on the top right down to your Lucian and bypass your Swain. So you do have to be careful when doing the early game positioning if you are getting a little bit lazy, and you have to watch out if people are all the way on the top right. To avoid that, you can simply move both range units in the bottom left and even put someone on the third row. That way they target the Swain, or you could just move someone front and center, and that avoids most of the wrapping. Next, I want to talk about certain tanks. So some tanks are better than others at different places. For example, Wukong, his passive, on death, he respawns again as a clone and just gives you an extra tank to work with. So what that means is that you don't want Wukong dying at the very end of the game. So you actually want him dying first. The reason why is because let's say you're playing this fight and Braum dies and Swain dies, then your Wukong dies, he spawns his clone, and then people attack the clone, and then they eventually get to your backline. Is that good? Is that bad? I mean, it's not the worst thing ever. Obviously, your tanks still did their job, but what if you can make it so that Wukong died first? You have the clone out, and while the clone out, Braum and Swain are still alive, then the clone dies, then they focus the rest of your tanks. That is going to be much better because your Braum and Swain would have been alive that entire time, doing their stuff, maybe casting an extra spell. So how do you make sure that always happens? Well, you want to put the tanks you want to die first all the way on the top left or top right, or just on the edge of your front line. Like let's say you don't have too many tanks, something like this. Wukong over there, another tank over here, and then they get focused first while the guys in the middle are relatively safe. They're still going to get hit by some people like their other tanks in the front line, but for the most part, most people put their carries in the corners, so you want to put your tanks all the way on the edges of your front line. This tip is especially useful if you have something like a Stone Plate or Mogul's Mail, because these 2 items really reward you when you are on the edge of the fight and targeted first, because Stone Plate makes it so that more enemies targeting you, the more resistances you get, and Mogul's Mail is after you take damage you get stacks, and then you get gold and armor and magic resist and health when you are stacking up. So you definitely really want that. There are times you want to solo frontline. When you unlock Sett, this can be especially useful because you need to do this solo frontline to unlock Sett if you need him in your comp. Obviously in this one you don't, but in other ones you do. But if you want to guarantee focus on your frontline unit, you can do the what's called the solo front line, where you third row or even back row all your other tanks or melees and just make sure your front guy gets all the aggro. You want to do this in the early game, not so much in the late game, because in the early game, a 2-star tank, especially like a 2-star 2 cost, 2-star 3 cost, something like that, they actually can survive this long, guarantee stack the Mogul's Mail, and get a ton of value from the Gargoyle Stoneplate. However, in the later parts of the game, they sometimes are not durable enough, and then it kind of griefs the rest of your positioning because your tanks, sometimes they don't walk up all the way because they have people wrapping around your Wukong, and then your tanks all of a sudden are on your second row, in which case some AoE abilities can hit your backliners a lot easier. So that's why you only do this in the early game for the solo frontline. Later on, you just want to put them on the edge, just like how you were before, and then put everyone else in the middle. And then that way, you still get a little bit value from the stone plate, but not to the point where it hurts the rest of your team. So those are the general basic positioning tips that you should know for every single game, no matter what set it is. I want to get into the more champion-specific ones right now. So let's talk about Tahm Kench first. He's in the middle of our screen. So Tahm Kench has some interesting strategies because he eats the unit that he's attacking and takes them off the map. If you kill it, you get a bunch of loot, which is really nice. So if they're holding items, you get one of the item components they had. So if someone had like a stone plate, you would get either a chain or a cloak, which is really nice, right? Like farming items is really, really good on Tahm Kench. However, if they don't have items, you just get their unit costs in gold. So if you eat a Swain and kill Swain in your tummy, yum yum, then you get 4 gold because Swain costs 4 gold. So what does that mean for positioning Tahm Kench? Well, it could mean a lot of things. You want to use him in different ways. If you have a weak Tahm Kench, he can't really kill too many things. You might want to eat the no item Swain and just get the gold. Or maybe it's even like a 3-cost unit, like a Sejuani or something like that, or like a Kabuko or Kennen. The reason why is because you want loot no matter what, and if your Tahm Kench doesn't have a lot of ability power, he's not going to be able to kill like a 3-star Nautilus with 3 items, or like a 2-star Wukong with a lot of items too. So when you first get Tahm Kench, be careful and don't get too greedy in eating their biggest guy. Sometimes you could just get the small cash outs. I'm not saying do it all the time, but it's something to consider. Another thing you want to do is you know that your opponent has a very strong tank and weaker tanks. So for example, on this board, Nautilus 3-star with 3 items is probably going to be a little bit tankier than Wukong. Maybe he only has 1 item, right? So who do you want to eat in that situation? There are going to be some times where you want to eat the biggest guy because then it takes them off the board and then your team can focus on other people. But there are going to be a lot of other times where you just want to farm items, in which case you want to target their weaker tank with items or their weakest tank with items, eat them, swallow them, and then print item components. That way you scale much better into the late game. So I'd say in the mid game of when you have Tahm Kench, you want to be eating their weakest tank pretty much all the time. That way you farm a lot of items and scale into the late game. However, in the late game, I think there's much more value in eating their biggest tank, even if you don't kill them, because you could take them off the board, and then the rest of your team can have a lot more impact. Remember when we were doing like the solo frontline version of the Wukong? This could be a very dangerous thing to do, and if you have Tahm Kench, you could counter this build very easily by just putting Tahm Kench right next to him, eating him, and then taking their stone plate unit off the board, and then you can focus down the rest of their team. So lots of ways to use Tahm Kench, but those are kind of the different types of things you need to consider when positioning him. If you want like AFK positioning for Tahm Kench, I'd say just put him in the middle. Most people put their weaker tanks directly in the middle, and then you can just get some nice little eat value. I mean, if you're AFK positioning with Tahm Kench, I guess it really doesn't matter, because like no matter what, you get a good outcome. If you eat their strongest tank, you have a higher chance of winning the fight, even if you don't kill them. And if you want to scale more into late game, you could eat one of the weaker units. That's pretty much the summary of playing Tahm Kench. Next unit I want to talk about is Diana, because everyone hates Diana, at least playing against her, because she's super duper 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 strong. So what you want to do with Diana is put her either here or here. That way she jumps to the top right or top left corner, because her ability makes her target the furthest champion that's 4 hexes away. Well, the furthest non-moonlit champion. So this is obviously really good because you get their backline carry or their primary carry, which is oftentimes in the bottom left or bottom right corner. So we're going to talk about how to counter that and also how to counter the counters. So one thing you should not do to counter Diana is position like this. Let's say you want to protect Azir and you're like, oh, Seraphine can be there and eat the first hit if their Diana is here. It's often a 50-50 between whether they go to Azir or Seraphine. This does not actually protect you against Diana, because even if she jumps to Seraphine, her second jump will jump to Azir anyways, and then she'll focus both of them down, and then you lose no matter what. So you have to do a little bit more than just create more targets in them. You have to actually move your unit away from the corner. So what you can do is do something like this, where if Diana's over here, she's going to target the Seraphine, and then she's going to jump to one of your tanks later because Azir isn't the furthest unit that's 4 hexes away. So this is one way to counter that. If you want to position on the bottom left, what some people like to do is just move them up here. And then again, the same thing. Diana's going to jump to the Seraphine, and then Azir's too close, so she's going to go somewhere else. And then your Azir is relatively safe. The last type of positioning that works against the default Diana boards is going to be doing something like this, where you set up your tank formation in what I call like a 4-1 formation. So you have 4 tanks over here on the left and 1 on the right. If Diana's over here, she's going to walk down this way, attack this guy, and then jump over here to the other tanks. She's not going to jump to Azir. If she walks up over here, she's again going to jump to the other tanks and not to your Azir. So that's another way to kind of defend against that. But now you might be wondering, hey, you are a Diana player. What can you do against some of these tricks? There obviously isn't a surefire way every time because it really depends on how they're positioning their tanks, because sometimes they could be doing something funky, leaving holes in random spots for units to walk up in. So if you do the tech where you place your Azir second from the corner so that if Diana's over here, she jumps to the Seraphine, what you can do instead is put Diana front and center. That way, she just jumps directly to the Azir, so pretty simple for that. If you do the little cubby formation, unfortunately, there's no way for Diana to perfectly counter this positioning, but I have some good news for you. You play Renekton in this comp, and what Renekton does is that he dashes to the lowest health enemy within 2 hexes. So if you put your Renekton in the corner over there, he's going to eventually make his way to the Azir and destroy him that way. So there's a little bit of a hidden synergy between Diana and Renekton, because Renekton kind of covers some of Diana's weaknesses. Unfortunately, for the last anti-Diana positioning where you leave a hole over there, there isn't any guaranteed surefire way to make it to Azir. But I have seen some people experimenting with moving their tanks around and then backlining their Diana. That way she walks up and goes to a weird position, and then she eventually jumps to Azir. Of course, I'm sure there's a way to counter that as well. So right before this fight starts, just move all your units around so no one can position against you. Now, some other tips for Diana is how should you position your other units when you play Diana? Well, if you're doing the default like off-center front row square, what you want to do is put your strongest tank on the corner where Diana is. So let's say you have 2-star Shyvana, 2-star Swain, 2-star Vi. Who should you put in the top left corner there? Well, obviously it's going to be Shyvana. Shyvana's probably going to be the tankiest person, so you want to put all your items on Shyvana, whatever they are, and that way Shyvana gets focus and then Diana doesn't take aggro as quickly. Diana's fine taking some damage, but she doesn't want to just take the brunt of the start of fight damage because she needs to stack her Rage Blade first in order to really get going, and the more time you give her, the better she's going to go infinite. So whoever your strongest tank is whenever you're playing this, like maybe you have a Nasus. Nasus is a super strong tank if you have it from Azir. Put your items on the 2-star Nasus, put them in the corner that Diana's in. If it's on the other side, do something like this, and then Nasus is going to take most of the damage, which allows Diana to scale up, and then Diana eventually kills their whole team. That's enough of Diana though. What about some other units? Well, honestly, Fizz has very similar interactions as Diana. You kind of want to position Fizz the same exact way. You want to put him in these 2 squares most of the time. That way they jump to the top left or top right corner units. He's not going to kill them as quickly because he jumps back and forth, but he will get them after a couple of tries. Speaking of some Bilgewater units though, if you're ever playing Twisted Fate in the early game, what you want to do is don't put Twisted Fate in the corner. He gets very bad angles whenever he's throwing from the corners. What you want to do instead is put him on this square, or this square. There's no other science other than like, trust me, bro, because I'm telling you, he just hits all the important units whenever he's on one of these 3 squares. So just put him there if you are itemizing him. If you have like the Bilgewater item, what's it called? Like Captain's Brew or something like that, the one that chills everyone and burns everyone. He's so good on these 3 squares because, again, he just hits all the key targets. Speaking of those weird offset positions, Seraphine also works really well on those squares. This one, and this one. She just hits more units when she does that. You could even put her dead center. I've seen her get really good angles either this way or this way. For Fiddlesticks, a lot of boards play Fiddlesticks. There are a couple of different positionings you can do with them. So most people default them to second row, which is honestly pretty fine. But if you ever get like a really strong Fiddlesticks, or if you really need to hit their backline, if you front row Fiddlesticks, he'll often get to the backline because his ability is hitting people within 2 hexes. And when he's doing his runaround thing, if he's in the front row and a little bit closer, he often hits the units all the way in the back row. Whereas if he's in the second row, he doesn't do it all the time. Apart from Seraphine and TF, Lux is also one of those units where you need to move around, and I think those little weird positionings work out a lot better than the dead corners. One very interesting play you could do with someone like Loris is if you're ever in a situation where you want to put one of your tanks in the second row, Loris is a very great candidate to be put there because what his ability does is he taunts people. So if you put him in the second row, he's obviously not going to take aggro right away. But once he walks up, casts his ability, he'll taunt people and then take aggro after that. Whereas if you put someone like, I don't know, like Kabuko there, he's just going to sit there, walk up, and then do his thing without taking too much damage that soon. But it doesn't always have to be Freljord. It's just like a popular reason why people put a tank in the second row. But if you ever have a reason to do that, always use Loris in that spot because, again, he can walk up and taunt people to retake aggro from whoever you're trying to protect. Speaking of Piltover units, if you ever have the T-Hex going, there are two places you want to place him. It's either over here or over here. These are the two areas you want to play him on because he just gets the best angles. Like, he just hits the most important units whenever he's here. And the eating units are either here or here. So just put whoever you can over there on those two hexes. But T-Hex should always be on the second row, all the way on the left or all the way on the right. For other expensive units, we could talk about Void. Baron has 3 different places he could go, and honestly, all 3 of them have their uses. He could either be front row, second row, or back row. When do you want to use each? So if you don't have too many tanks, Baron front row works perfectly well. Just make sure you surround him with a bunch of units so he doesn't take too much damage. But if you ever need like a bit more beefiness from your team, or maybe you don't have any tanks, putting him in the front row honestly works pretty well. And honestly with Baron, once you get him, you win every fight anyway, so the 3 different positionings, I'll be honest, don't really matter too much. But the other 2, which are more popular, like the front row is a bit rare, is going to be either second row or back row. So I think back row as a default is the best place to put Baron because his ability, when he's choosing a target, he like runs up and dashes and knocks people up. So getting a nice little free knock up at the start of the fight is always nice. However, oftentimes you can't really choose who his target is when you do that. So if you really need to take down a specific opponent, putting him on the second row is really nice because you could aim it at certain people very, very easily. So those are the 2 things to consider when you're doing a more offensive Baron. So another expensive unit that you want to worry a lot about is going to be Sett. Sett, the way to unlock him is you have to solo frontline someone, so that's the Stoneplate tech that we talked about before. But after you get him, you don't want to put Stoneplate on him. You want to build him as like an AP frontline damage dealer. But another thing you need to do with Sett is make sure he dies first. He has a very similar effect to Wukong, so if you take damage, his passive is the boss. Once he drops below 45% max HP, he leaves combat, then comes back even stronger. So you want to activate that as quickly as possible because he's super good and you don't want him to be the last one to die on your team because then he doesn't use his passive or use his trait that well. But if you ever have like Wukong and Sett on your team, you often have Wukong on one corner, Sett on the other. That way they both get targeted by either side and then activate their passives in that manner. The last tank I want to talk about today is going to be Skarner. So if you didn't know, Skarner is unlocked by fielding a non-tank unit with Gargoyle Stoneplate and also be level 7. So he's a very good unit, but he's often played with the Gargoyle Stoneplate. And the reason why is because like you have to build it to unlock him. So oftentimes you want to swap that item over onto Skarner later. So Skarner, again, his best place to be is going to be either top left or top right. But he also has an ability that impales 3 enemies in a line, which also benefits him from being all the way on the side. That way he could throw his ability and oftentimes hit 3 tanks or 3 frontliners and then grab them and CC them for a little bit. Next, I want to talk about Disruptors. So Disruptors, what they do is when they cast their ability, or their abilities, they dazzle enemies, and dazzled units deal reduced damage. So you want to make sure you actually position your Disruptors in a way that is beneficial and actually hits targets that you want to target. So obviously for Seraphine, it's very easy because she hits so many people. So you put her in one of those like 4 spots that we talked about before. But if you ever have something like Echo or Gwen, something that's a little more focused in targeting, just make sure that they're in front of whoever you want to target. For example, if someone has like a Tryndamere or something like that, put your Echo in front of the Tryndamere so that he hits him and reduces his damage by a little bit. It's not going to make or break a lot of fights, but it is better than nothing. One very cool disruptor is going to be Mel. A lot of people are messing up against Mel because Mel, what she does is she throws a thing and then within a 3 hex radius, it does some crazy damage. So normally when that happens, like let's say Mel's on the other team, she shoots her orb, it hits this echo, and then within 3 hexes, stuff is being hit. Notice how your units in the backline are mainly safe. The only time something dicey can happen is if you're running a 2-range unit. For example, if you had a Gwen out against Mel, that's a very, very bad thing to do because Mel can use her ability. Sometimes it can hit the Gwen and then it'll hit the 3 hex radius and hit the backline, and you're going to be in a lot of trouble because then your backliners take a bunch of damage. So what you do to avoid that is just frontline some of your 2-range units if you're ever against Mel. That way she doesn't get those crazy casts against your team. Speaking of fighters and tanks, so there are different roles in TFT. Some units are tanks, some units are fighters, some are marksmen, some are some other stuff. But let's focus on the fighters and the tanks. So what tanks do is they take aggro at the start of the fight, or they have like target priority for the enemy team. So what you want to do is make sure your fighters are protected by them. So you don't want like your Tryndamere taking aggro first, right? Like remember we were playing the Diana in the front row. You don't want Diana taking damage in the first part of the fight because you want your tanks to, you know, tank, right? However, you may often see people put their carries in the front line and they're like pretty safe. And the reason why that happens is because, again, each unit has a role, and the tanks generally prefer taking aggro over the other units. So if you ever have a tie, it's going to target the tank first. So that's pretty nice, but sometimes I see people making the mistake of putting 2 fighters next to each other when they have a setup like this, where they have 3 fighters, 4 tanks in the front. And sometimes you could get into a lot of trouble, especially if you do like 3 in a row. That way, all 3 of your fighters, they will get targeted because one of them isn't taking tank duty. So what you can do to avoid that is make sure you like alternate between squares to make sure a tank is always tanking for one of your more delicate units. Another thing you could do is second row your fighters. You don't have to do this all the time. Obviously Gwen's 2 range, so you probably second row her anyways, but for someone like Tryndamere, it's fine to second line him because it guarantees that the tanks up front will take aggro and then he'll walk up and start whacking people. Another thing to note is that if you're against someone who's like weak side or strong side, so what weak side and strong side mean is, let's say they have 2 backline carries. One of them is like their super carry, and then the other one is just their guy that's holding random items that they have left over. Their weak side would be the person who has leftover items, and their strong side would be the person with their primary items. So if you ever have a melee carry, and if they're single target, like, okay, Mel and Seraphine are not the best examples. Let's go to Kai'Sa and Kog'Maw. So oftentimes if you're facing Void, you see Kai'Sa and Kog'Maw. Obviously the Kai'Sa is going to be doing a lot of damage, right? So you don't want to put your Tryndamere right in front of her, and then Tryndamere gets focused down and attacked and killed. What you can do instead is put Tryndamere on the weak side, get focused down by the Kog'Maw, and that's perfectly fine because your Tryndamere oftentimes has lifesteal. So all the damage, or like the little damage that Kog'Maw is doing, isn't going to do much to Tryndamere, and in fact is actually good because it saves your tanks a little bit of HP when you are going against someone's weak side. So that's another thing to look for when scouting. See whether you can be on strong side or weak side whenever you have a melee carry. You oftentimes want to be on their weak side. That way you don't get focused by their high single target damage dealer right away, and you kill everyone else. Sometimes you could even wrap around, like if they are careless and have like a lot of units in the back line, like let's say they have something like this, with 4 long shot. I know that's not a comp right now, but it could be later. Sometimes Tryndamere can kill the tank, walk to Kog'Maw, kill him, kill him, kill him, and kill him. Sometimes you can get wrapped that way, so you have to be very careful and try to avoid that. Speaking of wrapping, sometimes when you play Freljord, especially in the early parts of the game, you can get wrapped very, very easily. Like let's say you are level 5 and you're positioned like this. This is very dangerous because if they do have a melee carry, they could be in the corner and walk down this way because their tanks block them from attacking Sejuani and Briar, and then go to your backline and kill them very, very easily. That can happen pretty often. So what some people do to kind of avoid this is put some tanks on the top right, that way they take aggro and then they'll walk to the Sejuani. Or what you can do instead is move your tower and put it doesn't have to be dead center, but it could be a little bit more towards the center. That way wrapping is a little bit more difficult. But if you want to be super safe, you can just put your tower completely dead center, and wrapping pretty much can't happen here if you have 2 tanks. So if you have like a Neeko, put her over here, and yeah, everyone will target the Sejuani, everyone will target the Neeko, and no one will wrap around to your Ashe and Draven. This problem really only arises with 3 Freljord, but it is something important to kind of look out for all the time. Last thing I want to go over are a couple of augments in the game. We're just going to cover 3 of them. So Obviously for stuff like air axiom, like the air hex, like just put your most important unit or the one you care about getting the buff on the hex. There's nothing too complicated there. But best friends is a little weird. You need to have allies isolated in pairs, and then they get bonus stats for that combat. Exiles is pretty hard to use. You need to have a champion adjacent to no other champions, and then you get a max health shield. And then lastly, there is one augment called Spirit of Redemption. This one gives you a Spirit Visage, but it also gives it an added effect of healing allies within one hex. So let's talk about how to position all of those. First one I want to go over is best friends. The easiest way to do it, if you have like 4 damage dealers, 4 tanks, it's like very simple to do. You just put them something like this. That way they're all in pairs, so you get the bonus pretty easily. If you ever have something like Azir, it gets a lot trickier because you get a lot of these random things and it can make your board very crowded and sometimes you won't be able to fit everything. But what I like to do is kind of have someone in front and then just put them a little bit behind like that. That way you could still have 6 units in the front line. And then obviously if you have an odd number, you can't best friend everyone. So just take the unit you don't care about the most and have them be alone. It's kind of like when the teacher tells you to pair up for a group project and then someone's left out, like, you know, it just happens. But best friends is pretty easy to do. Let's talk about exiles. Exiles can be a little bit tricky. So the easiest way to position it, if you have level 8 and 8 units, is just do 4 front row, 4 back row. That's very easy to do. But if you ever have more than 10 units, let's say you have like a Fiddlesticks and a Tarek, it can be troublesome to fit all 10 of these units into your board. But there are ways to do that. You have to do this little like kind of, I don't know what it is. It's like a chess knight configuration where you kind of move everyone a little bit offset to each other. And then you can actually fit 10 units on your board. There might be a way to fit 11. I haven't really dealt with 11. Like if you're level 9 with Azir, you're going to have 11 units in there. But I don't really recommend playing Azir with exiles because it's going to make the positioning very, very funky. If someone knows a way to fit 11 units on your board, let me know. But this is a sample way to fit 10 units. Also, don't play exiles or best friends with a comp like Freljord because Freljord requires you to group up a lot of your units. Last thing we need to cover is the Spirit Visage. So Spirit Visage is honestly pretty easy to use. You just want to make sure you actually get value from it. So you could obviously surround your tank. That way the Spirit Visage heals everyone around them from the redemption effect. And that's all fine and dandy, but it's not the best because as we said before, you want your main tank to do the bulk of the tanking. So one way to get around this is not put him dead center. What you could do is put him on the side, but kind of leave like a gap there. On your strong side. So then this unit gets targeted by the unit in the top left, and then the second tank walks up and still gets healed by the redemption effect. So this is good, again, because you still have your main tank doing most of the tanking. Like maybe you have a stone plate on him or whatever, but you also get a good healing effect, healing the people around him. Obviously, for any 2 range units, you want to put them right behind him as well. That way they also get the heal effect there. But that's going to be all the tips that I have for positioning for this set. If I have more, I'll be posting them somewhere. But I think the beginner section is probably the most important to get to because a lot of people just don't do it. Like even in like masters and stuff, like I see people make basic positioning mistakes. It could be just because they forgot that day, you know, like I'm sure most people know how to position stuff if you actually take the moment to think about it. But these are always important to kind of use for like 99% of your games. And obviously all the little champion tricks, hopefully they help win you a few games here and there. But that's going to be it for me today. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video and I'll see you all in the next one.